and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Malaysia's rental market has often been criticised for lacking proper regulation, relying instead on tenancy agreements and contract law. And despite years of deliberation, we still do not have much clarity on the proposed Residential Tenancy Act. So what would it take to make this proposed legislation strike the right balance between tenant protections and landlord rights? Joining me on the show today to discuss this further, I have social policy and human rights specialist Simraatraj Kaur Dhillon, as well as Muhammad Nazhan Kamaruzuki. He's the research associate at Khazanah Research Institute, and he recently was the lead author of the opinion piece towards a secure and fully functioning housing rental sector. Thank you both for being on the show with me today. It's good of you to be here in the studio to talk about this. I remember talking about the need for a Residential Tenancy Act for years now, and it seems to be in the making, but not quite materialized yet. Simrat, if I may begin with you, what do you think this means for Malaysia? The fact that we don't have an RTA, Residential Tenancy Act, what does that mean for tenants and landlords alike? Maybe you can lay out the scene for us.
Thank you, Melissa, for having us. Thank you for the question. I think what it means is that there is a huge rental market that goes unregulated. For tenants, this means that processes to apply for rental properties, there's no streamline when it comes to that, right? So this is where most of the discrimination happens on behalf of the tenants. And then on behalf of the landlords, this sort of gives them the right to then discriminate against tenants that come from certain minority groups, right? So because there is a lack of legislation in this area, this huge problem of unregulation where certain groups of individuals are treated differently compared to others is very, very rampant.
Right, okay. I want to come back to the issue of discrimination. I know you feel very passionate about that and you've studied that, researched that quite a bit. But Nazhan, talk to me a little bit about the lay of the land. When you look at the current state of Malaysia's rental market, in terms of protection and regulation, what stands out most to you in terms of the challenges, the issues that are faced by both tenants and landlords?
Right. So, thank you for having me today. So, yes, as you rightly mentioned, at the moment we do not have a single reference point, like a set of legislation or statute that can serve not only to solve contractual disputes, like your tenancy agreements, who will take care of the deposit, that's kind of details, but also to uphold and lay down the bigger humanizing housing agenda, which is mentioned and which is quite significant at this moment because Malaysian is elected as the president for UN Habitat Assembly. And what does it mean? What does UN Habitat says about housing? I don't remember, so I'm going to read this.
Okay, sure.
Everyone has a fundamental human right to housing, which ensures access to a safe, secure, habitable and affordable. And longer ones, housing is more than just a roof, it's an opportunity for better life and better future. So there are quite big dreams, and why we need this Residential Tenancy Act, not just to solve the contractual disputes like you mentioned, who's going to take care of what's kind of the process, but also to really uphold this and operate these big dreams. So at this, back to the questions.
Well, actually, before we get into that, may I just get you to elaborate on that? I'm so glad you brought that up, because let's zoom out a bit and look at our macro approach, our Malaysia's approach to housing policy and the rental sector. I have my observations personally. I just think that Malaysia's approach, in a sense, is that Malaysia treats renting as unworthy of serious concern. It is seen as a phase that young people go through. It is seen to be almost a consequence. If you don't work hard enough to own, you'll then have to rent. Whereas we forget the kind of social justice dimension of it. It is the most vulnerable of our society, right? The migrant workers, the single moms, the low-income households that will have to resort to renting.
Yes.
Talk to me a little bit about that, how you kind of broadly look at Malaysia's housing sector and in this humanizing housing agenda, what that means.
Right. So we have to know, as we as a nation gets more urbanized, there will be more population that are renting. You know, they move to bigger cities like KL, Petaling, all these urbanized districts have higher percentage of people, household renting compared to their other districts in the same state or compared to the national average itself. For example, Malaysia in 2022, renting population is about 20%, but KL is 30-something, 37.
Wow.
Yeah, same goes for Petaling. Same goes for Johor Bahru. So as we get more urbanized, more economic activities, more economic growth, we should expect this renting population more significant, and we should not neglect them. And coming to back your Malaysia housing policy, so well, yes, it has been very centric to home ownership, either to promote home owning or to own a house. You have, for example, social housing, which is your PPR, that is to be owned and versus to rent. And also you have Prima House for the middle income earners. You also, that's housing supply itself. And then you also have government guaranteed scheme for those who want to earn but do not have formal pay slip. So we have been very active in promoting home ownership. But we have to make sure that renting should be a sustainable way as well, because you know there's a needs for that. Yeah, as you rightly mentioned, there's a youth coming, and then there's some people that just prefer renting. Yeah,
it's a choice, right?
It's a choice. But I have to give credits. During the Putra Heights incidents, right? Accident where the explosion happened. So it was the first time that government really looked at the renting population, whereby not just homeowners get some assistance, but also the tenants who rent there, who were also the victim. For unlike during COVID-19 pandemic, whereby homeowners got their moratoriums to help them with financial difficulties, but during this unexpected incident happened, tenants were taken into consideration in the government assistance program. Of course, we can debate about the amount, you know, it's a bit lower, but at least we have moved a little bit better.
At least tenants aren't invisible to the policy, right? Yeah. Simrat, do you think that renting will become a more permanent way of life for Malaysians? Is that the future you see for Malaysia's rental market?
I think in the current economic state that we are in, I think it is going to be at least projection-wise, it is going to be a reality for many Malaysians. I think not just among young people, people who are in their 20s, but people who are in their 30s and in their 40s, especially taking into consideration the unstable job market that there is. You know, home ownership is not cheap. It comes with its own set of challenges. Most people nowadays tend to buy homes when they're in their 50s, when they're in their 40s, right? And so majority of your life, renting is going to be your option.
Which is why we need to have better regulation for this, particularly with discrimination. This is something that you have long felt strongly about, if I understand correctly. But mostly when you talk to people, it's always anecdotal, right? You hear of these instances. What does the data actually say? How widespread is this problem based on your research?
I think, to keep it short, you know, the short answer would be it's very difficult to quantify because it is more widespread than we know. So in my research, you know, I interviewed there was about 30 people, and every single person had experienced rental discrimination, majority of which come from the Indian community. And this 30, it just represents just a small amount of people in Klang Valley. But, you know, when you have the resources, you know, later on when research expands and when you actually quantify it, it's definitely widespread in many states as well. And the issue with rental discrimination or racism in the rental market is that it's so subtle, and it sometimes happens so overtly that it is a phenomenon that is really difficult to quantify.
Right.
And that's why for my research that I did, we focused mainly on qualitative research, focusing on the stories that are happening on the ground, because quantity, the number itself, cannot really, you know, it can show you a certain figure, but that doesn't really talk about the realities on the ground, the complexity of the issue, how discreetly it happens sometimes. You know, it's not always flashy where there's like an advertisement that says, oh, no Malay, no Indian. Sometimes it's not like that. Sometimes, you know, when the landlord is speaking to a person, like this is from when I was interviewing my participants, when the landlord is speaking to you, from your intonation and the way you speak, they can already tell what kind of race you are from. And so sometimes the landlords just do not respond to these you know, potential tenants.
Yeah, profiling,
yes,
right? You can just tell by the name.
The racial profiling. Sometimes they just ask you for your identity card, you send it to them, and immediately they ghost you, or they don't respond to you.
If I may add to that, why we need, I'm trying to link it between racial discrimination and what is happening with why we need the Residential Tenancy Act, right? So at the moment, we do not have a single reference point for legal framework, but we have scattered rules and regulation that currently framing and governing the rental market, and these are not adequate. These acts regulation are not adequate. For example, like you mentioned, Contract Act 1950, you are allowed to make business deal, agree, willing buyer, willing seller to whomever you want. Similarly, you also are allowed to not make a deal, you know, not willing buyer, not willing seller to whomever you want. And you don't have to give any specific reason for that. So the current governing framework is allowing for this process,
allowing it to happen.
The loophole is giving the outcome is there.
I have heard that the most common objection to a Residential Tenancy Act is that the government should not regulate the landlord-tenant relationship because it is a matter between two consenting parties. It is a private agreement, a private contract to two parties. And I want to ask you about that because a recent survey by Architects of Diversity found that 50% of Malaysians believe landlords should be allowed to choose tenants based on race. They say that this is personal preference, that this is the fundamental right of property owners to do so. How do you respond to that?
I think that is actually a very important point that needs to be tackled with head front when we are talking about Residential Tenancy Act, because although it is a very important piece of legislation, I'm of the opinion that it is not the only solution to solve discrimination that happens in the rental market, because we do need to, even when I was interviewing landlords for this research, we do need to really acknowledge the fact that when you buy a home, you do have certain rights that are attached to it, and that includes the right to use your property in the way that you want to use. For example, if I'm not justifying racism or anything in any way, but we need to acknowledge that this is the right of a homeowner.
Of a private property.
Of a private property, right? So to what extent do you then want to let the government regulate and tell you how to use your property? And this is where most of the pushback comes from. And that is why I think we'll get into it later, but you know, which is why I don't think that the RTA itself is sufficient to govern discrimination, because unless of course there are certain elements that can be included in the RTA, but in itself we need and we must take into consideration the rights of property owners.
Okay, I hear you. So, so an RTA won't solve discrimination in the rental market, but maybe becomes a point of regulation, right? Because you said there's no single reference point. How do you see that, Nazhan?
So, like I mentioned, the Contract Act 1950 and other commercial contracts that governing the rental sector now you are allowed to do business whoever you want and whoever you don't want, right? Similarly, without the single reference, without a Residential Tenancy Act, we tend to let the market be as it is, or in economics they call it laissez-faire. So, and what are the outcomes? Remember, what the other outcomes? Remember, we once it was on the news, the coffin rooms scenario, right? So, as we becoming more developed nation, more progressive, your economic activities become more complex. Is this, coffin room, substandard living condition, are this something that we want to offer to our people? Not just our people, maybe those people outside that come to our country with hopes and everything. Are this something like we want to offer to them? Substandard kind of living? Rooms with no safety precaution and no ventilation, something like that. Of course, it is, market. It's a free market, market-driven.
But there still should be some regulation against exploitation. That was exploitative, those coffin rooms, wasn't it?
Yes, exactly. So if we don't have any kind of regulations, then this would happen. Yeah, it doesn't happen to you, but I don't know, maybe our grandchildren, our children will
yes,
soon
definitely.
To be that.
You never know when you will become society's most vulnerable population, right? Let's talk about what we want to see in a possible RTA. Who knows when we'll see one? Hopefully, it's being drafted, I hear. I hope it's being drafted. So let's talk about what we would like to see in an RTA for Malaysia. If you were to think about the priorities to address some of the problems we talked about while balancing kind of tenant and landlord rights. Simra, if I may ask you, what would you prioritize in it?
I think firstly, it would be streamlining the process of applications when it comes to rental. Having a set of, not to say rules, but having a fixed set of requirements on what you need when a tenant approaches you. I think that's really important because that's something that I've noticed that's been very different communities and different individuals get asked different things.
May I ask, could you elaborate, what do you mean by that?
For example, if a landlord suspects that you are from a minority community and they do not want to rent to you, sometimes they ask your IC. But for example, some of the tenants that I spoke to who are from a Chinese background, they are not asked these documents. So having a set streamlined process of what exactly happens. And I think secondly, very strong anti-discrimination policies, holding landlords accountable for practicing the racial preferences when it comes to renting. Thirdly, the most important thing I would say is having a very efficient complaint mechanism, because the first two things are not going to work if communities who are affected or individuals who are affected have no way to resort to complain these things, which is what has been happening now. If I've experienced rental discrimination in the market,
where do you go?
Where do I go? Exactly. You have platforms like Property Guru who are a lot more regulated. You can complain directly, on these platforms. But majority of the participants or majority of people that experience rental discrimination mostly look through websites like Facebook Marketplace or Muda, iBilek, these kinds of platforms that are not really regulated, don't really have strong complaint mechanisms. So establishing that is really important. Otherwise, everything is just going to fall flat.
And that's why you hear of people taking to social media to complain. Because what other avenues do they have? Nazhan?
So, what we should expect from residential tenancy? I don't want to talk about the detailed process about it. I mean, that's something else. But also, we have to ensure that the Residential Tenancy Act has the spirit that is shared commonly with the UN Habitat. And like I said, everyone has a fundamental human rights to housing, which ensures access to safe, secure, habitable, and affordable. So, it's beyond racial discrimination issues. You are actually not just limiting people, addressing there's no limitation to secure a proper house, a decent house, but also tenants would feel belonging to that community. At the moment, for example, in a strata community, by default, tenants are not, do not have votes to their strata community. they feel isolated.
Yeah.
And I want to bring another example. Our youngsters who live in a shared houses with a lot of multiple rooms, they also feel isolated, right?
Yeah.
They don't mingle with the community. And if you have this vision to create inclusive cities, inclusive Kuala Lumpur structure plan has this ambition.
Yeah.
How do you connect that? How do you take our tenants, our renters population into the process of making livable and inclusive cities?
Yeah,
Yes.
that is such a great point. Thank you for highlighting that, because we forget that renters are part of the social fabric
As
too,
is.
belonging to a community as well, and often invisible, right? No rights, not involved in community decisions. Very great point in terms of bringing renters into the conversation as well. And as you mentioned, with urbanization, it will grow.
Yes.
Renting will become, will grow. If we do come to the point where we're seeing a residential tenancy bill tabled, and hopefully we'll see that soon, can I ask both of you, from your research and your observations, what your concerns are in terms of the implementation of such legislation? Where do you anticipate pushback coming from? And are the biggest obstacles political? Are they economic? Are they bureaucratic? What do you both think? Simran?
I think there could be, I think the main pushback could be economic as well, in terms of we don't want to disrupt the renters market in a way and scare landlords away from trying to rent, because it is a market on its own, right, that sustains the economy. So I think the pushback could come in that way, and something that that needs to be taken into consideration is how do you balance between protecting tenants as well as ensuring private property rights. How much is the Act going to encroach your private property rights?
Sure.
Because that is a huge debate, that's a huge argument, and I foresee there going to be a pushback as well. And in terms of implementation, I think, again, we were talking about this earlier, how discrimination can be so overt, it can be so subtle. How do you know you're being discriminated against, right?
You can't explain it, but you know, right?
You know. If your landlord doesn't respond to you, oh, maybe he hates me, or does he not, does he not want me to rent his property? So these kinds of things are very subtle and difficult to measure in that sense, different to other forms of legislation. And coming back to my point, which is why I think that the RTA should exist with other mechanisms. We can, if we have time, we can address this later. And then I think that way it would be a multifaceted way to address the whole issue of rental discrimination.
All right. In terms of pushbacks, right? It depends, Melisa. It depends. It could be us. It could be me. I am push this, against this law.
Depending on the law.
Depending. Consider this. Consider this. Well, if you have a bunch of landlords sitting in a meeting room discussing about policy, drafting the Residential Tenancy Act, what kind of Residential Tenancy Act would you expect? If they are all landlords discussing that, drafting that. All right. Now I'm going back to. I'm going to share a bit of a short story why landlords are called landlords, not house lord. So it goes back to the old feudal system. Basically, landlords means the owner of the lands, right? And during all modern times, landlords were only responsible to provide a land with maybe some basic infrastructure, not really to ensure safetiness or habitable or decent quality of the properties. So of course, there's a dispute on that. Tenants brought this up to the court and they checked the law. Actually, it's no problem for landlords to do so, to neglect that issues that you bring. You don't have, your property don't have a proper piping, proper heating or proper cooling. Why you think so? It was because the landlord made the law. Right. So again, my point is that depending, I haven't seen the draft yet.
Depending on who makes the law.
Exactly. But of course, when it was proposed in the National Housing Policy 2.0, the government really stated that the law would ensure would serve the best interest of landlords and as well as the tenants. So they are finding the balance there, right? Yeah. So I mean, you look at the current law as well. There's a debate. For example, when it comes to eviction, it wasn't easy. It is not easy for landlords to evict people. It takes quite a long process. You know, sometimes it would hurt for the genuine landlords. So think about that. Landlords should think about that as well. But again, it depends who created or who draft the law.
Yeah, which is why I think, you know, a point that's really important here is that while the government is drafting the law, I think consultations with different kinds of stakeholders is extremely important. You need the landlords in the conversation, you need the renters in the conversation, the CSOs and everybody who's working on this issue in the conversation. Because if they're not here, then how are you going to reflect their best interest when you don't know what their best interest is? You need to hear them out and you need to listen to them.
Both of you, thank you so much for shedding some much needed light on this matter. I appreciate your time. Thank you both. That's all the time we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.